Thank you very much, Marion, for a thought-provoking conversation around some of the challenges we face as a whole city, and then bringing it back to where we are at the moment. I'm going to open up to questions. I'm sure Marion will take a few questions if there's some from the floor. Anyone has some questions for Marion, and please. So.
Do you think if we went from single-storey residences to double-storey residences at least, we would halve the problem with people having to live so far away?
I don't understand what we're scared about in terms of height, because in appropriate locations it really shouldn't be something to fear. And I remember when Alana McTinnon was the planning minister and I headed up a peak body that looked after land developers, and I was looking out my office window and we were having this screeching row about density, and I was looking at South Perth and I said, Minister, what's the problem? When we get it right, we do it well, and I think that there's in this locality, Brownlee Towers is the one exemplar that's continually held up as being something that we did wrong. But when there's very few examples of doing something wrong and very few examples of doing something right, we have to look to other areas to say, well, where can we do it around transit nodes, around shopping centres, where it makes sense. So you're not impinging on that sense of people's private property rights, and two-storey seems to be one of those issues. If you've got a single-storey house next to you as a neighbour, they feel that all of a sudden their privacy has been eroded. So it's probably about doing it in much more appropriate locations so that we can keep the relatively suburban nature of Perth. It seems to be what people like. I live in suburbia, I like it. But if people want to live in higher density, they should also be allowed to do that too. And I'm originally from Sydney, although I've lived here for a long time. And my first flat was a 4-storey walk-up, and we had to lug all our furniture up those 4 stories. There was no lift. So there's a lot more sort of entry-level product in other cities that we don't seem to have here in Perth. But then also coming back to the expectation, first-time owners, what I'm being told is going into those newer developments, and not only are they moving into the brand new home, they're also moving in with all the brand new kit. So they're staying at home longer to save more, to get into bigger debt. And most of the people in this room who are old like me would remember that you had newspaper up at your windows and you didn't have carpet. So it's this change of expectation as well. So there's quite a few issues at play there. But we could use land better, and certainly land around transport routes would be the most appropriate for density.
Yeah, God forgive would it ever be anything like Tokyo. I used to live in Tokyo, and 32 million people live in the same area that Perth is. And I know but it's all double storey. There's very few 3-storey residences, and they all seem to be, apart from the rat race, they seem to be coping fairly well.
And that's an interesting example. We often bring international experts over to reflect on other cities. And we actually saw an aerial shot of Tokyo, and very much the sort of central business district and the big towers. And then it sort of bleeds out quite quickly into a very sort of suburban city, which surprised me because all you ever see of Tokyo is the high rise. So we managed to do it reasonably well.
There's a question down here at the front, please.
I was just wondering, with an influx of so many people, and with us having such a water problem now, what part of this plan is being looked at with us? How do we live without water?
That's more Mike's area than mine. Our water security is basically controlled by government through the Water Corporation, and I think that there's a sense that we can engineer our way out of it so that it'll just be more desal plants. But that means water's going to be very expensive.
Okay,
it's your
I guess one of the really simple things about Perth and population and water is that about 60% of the water that we use as homeowners is actually on the garden. So one of the very simple things is about smaller blocks and less gardens, which is a real cultural change from having a backyard and having a garden and all those sort of things. But that's just the simplistic way to answer the question, if you like. But that is part of the challenge as we move forward. I've been involved in water and urban planning and the interface between urban development and planning for about 20 years. And I personally feel that if we continue down the path of lots and more desalination plants, we're kidding ourselves in terms of a city because we're not living within our means. So part of the conversation has to be how do we address that issue as we move forward? And it's not a simple one, but the simplest one that often gets pitched is that if we live on smaller blocks of land, we'll use less water. But I think that's a bit simplistic in many ways.
We also need to keep the trees, because if we start building without keeping the trees, in the Oxford, we're not going to attract rainfalls either. It's going to be very difficult.
Sorry for stealing the
No,
thunder,
you go.
but what you come down to is what gets referred to as the urban heat island effect. And there's increasing evidence that in, certainly work in Melbourne and other places, that as places have got hotter, and when you get more extreme hot weather events, people get much more prone to having heart attacks and those sort of things. So you get all of those things. So you do have to find a way to actually, if you like, re-ecologise your city as well as managing your resource flows, your water flows and those things. So please, other questions? And to Marion.
I'd just like to respond to that lady there. We did an exercise and sort of said, what is it that we value about Perth? Because I've got a sense that the conversation about the future of Perth gets anxious because it's not inscribed in stone what it is that we really value about the Perth we have now. And the things that came up were lifestyle, but particularly the natural environment. So you go to other cities that have pretty lacklustre water environments like Melbourne and Brisbane, and they've just managed to really make something out of nothing. And what we've got is this fantastic resource and a beautiful natural setting, and I'm not sure that we revere it enough, and I'm not sure that government funds its care enough either. So the Swan River and the Swan and Canning River systems, I think, is a classic example of that. So forgive me for the figures because they're not exactly right, but the Swan River Trust did a community values survey of about 4,000 people, and very strongly the Swan River came up to 80% or something. People highly valued the Swan River.
There's no fish in it, and it's filthy, and it needs cleaning completely, Swan.
But it gets such little funding.
I know. Because if they could do it in Britain with the Thames, which they did, and cleaned it up, put fish back in, they did it there. So we can do it here.
And part of our Aboriginal conversations and consultations have been about the health of Perth as an ecological environment. And the Aboriginal men have very strongly come out and said that they want to see the health of the river as one of the key things about Perth moving forward.
So other questions, please? There must be others. Please, the other thing.
My question's probably a little bit ignorant, so I don't know all the policies and things behind it, but I was confused as why there's so many vacant blocks of land around Perth as well. It seems like there's land that's just been sitting there for years and years and never been built on in really high suburbia areas.
It could be a range of things. So people could own individual lots for investment value and there's no impetus on them to build. Could be redundant WAPC land, waiting for a road reserve or something to come through.
That happens. But just even within the city of Canning, and one of the big challenges the city has in moving forward in terms of the mixed-use development is there's about 20 hectares, or give or take, of redevelopable land, either vacant or redevelopable land, right next to the Cannington train station. So that's one place where, in theory, it should be easy to get some level of density that's appropriate, right next to good public transport. So there is a lot of land dotted around the place, like you say.
And what's the impediment to that?
Well, what's the impediment is the question that we're actually starting to ask. To some extent, it's a stigma, and investment hasn't come running into that area, and other things are about exactly the various planning policies that are in place are a little out of date. So we're working through that process as part of
It's
our...
also to do with you don't own some of that land around the bridge.
No, I mean the city owns a very small proportion of land, but there's land in government ownership and land in other private ownership.
Or other investment like estate planning or something that's...
Yeah, there's a range of ownership there.
Yeah,
but I mean,
that you can't do anything with it unless they release it.
that's right. I mean the point is though that there, within the broader metropolitan area there is pockets of land that could be increased development. So other questions about the sort of the challenges we face as the city moves forward and the demography changes.
I'm just concerned about what we do in Canning too. We can actually make ourselves an island without taking into consideration what's happening around us. Like, you look at along Nicholson Road, and you've got all the boarding kennels, you've got little goat farms, you've got the egg factories, and the more those areas build up, the more pressure is going to be put on those industries to be pushed further away for rehousing. So where does that end up for people in Canning who need those services? Is there anywhere that cottage industry can be looked at and respected as a valid long-term supply to local people?
I can't answer it from a Canning perspective, but I'll reflect on what happened in Wanneroo with the market gardens and piggeries and things. The land prices actually got so valuable that those cottage industries were quite happy to sell on to a developer for a commercial gain. So Wanneroo doesn't look anything like it used to look even 20 years ago. So I can't reflect on what that's going to mean to for your community, but certainly that's what happened in Wanneroo.
And I guess the slight contrast to what's happened in Wanneroo is what happened about 20 odd years ago, 15 years ago, in the Swan Valley. There was a big pressure for the Swan Valley to be basically turned into housing from its traditional role as being a vineyard and a horticultural area. And what was actually put in place was the Swan Valley Planning Act, which basically protected that type of land use, so that those sorts of industries could stay. And some of the owners there were dead against that. But what's happened over that period of time is it's become a big asset for that type of use into the future. And the question for the sorts of areas you're talking about is, do you protect those areas and zone them and protect them for those sorts of ongoing, planning jargon referred to periurban industries, if you like, the things that we need around us, whether it's a market garden or a plant nursery or a chook farm or whatever it is. They're all things that we need. And the issue of food security for cities is a topical conversation that needs to be solved or need to be thought about in the context of a growing city as well. And Richard Weller will probably talk a little bit more about that at our next session. Any other questions? Please.
Transport, public, private, you create just regional hubs, or because people who do Armdale want to go to CBD, if we're going to be that big here, they're still got to come through. And
the state government,
extra people that you're saying, basically doubling in the metro area, so road infrastructure, where is the government heading? What does that mean?
the state government's developing a 20-year transport strategy. I understand it's with Cabinet at the moment. It's going to require incredible amounts of investment, and that's what I've sort of said in my commentary, that there's really not a sense of urgency. So the fact that the trains are full, even if they ordered new carriages tomorrow, is not going to have any effect on delivery for 2 years. So this is what I mean about this sort of pressures of growth. People that are on trains that are packed and can't see any end in sight, and it's day in, day out, they're really going to start to vote with their feet and put some political pressure on. So even if they've got a plan that's 20 years for the future, it's not going to help the here and now. So, I talked to Alana McTennan about this, who obviously was the one responsible for delivering the Southern Suburbs railway line. And she said all of the projections for when they were going to reach a good level of uptake was 5 years, and they reached that in the first 6 months. So there's this sense that the bureaucracy tends to underdo the numbers. So it worries me that the 20-year transport plan is going to be quite unambitious about what do we need now to suit our needs now as well as into the future. And also light rail needs to come into that mix. And how, we've got this very radial system, things radiate out from the city into the suburbs, we've got main roads and we've got the rail lines. We actually need orbital systems as well that start connecting. Not everyone's going into the city or out of the city. So we've got to have this sort of sense of having an orbital system as well. And I think if you try and get around the universities, particularly Curtin University in the morning, much more public transport's needed there, and light rail's probably one of the pieces that needs to go into that puzzle. But it's going to be expensive, and I think politically probably quite unpalatable, because we're talking about billions.